I have always felt that some relationships are not heavy because of noise, but because of silence. My relationship with my father was just like that. We lived in the same house, walked in the same courtyard, yet between us, there was something that couldn't be seen, but was deeply felt. My father spoke very little, and I wanted to say so much. From childhood, I had learned to keep my voice low in front of him, to hide my emotions, and if tears came, to wipe them away immediately. He wasn't strict, just silent, and perhaps he didn't realize how much his silence left questions in my heart. When I returned from school, placing my notebook in front of him, he would glance at it and say, "Good, but it could have been better." I would nod, but somewhere inside, a voice would rise. Would this ever be enough? I wasn't hungry for praise. I just wanted to know that I was right in my father's eyes. As time passed, I grew up. My achievements increased. My responsibilities too. Yet my father's words remained the same. Mother often said, "Your father is like this. He's not a bad man." I knew that. Perhaps that's why even my anger carried respect. But there were nights when I would sit alone in my room, thinking, is being a daughter ever enough? I wanted to talk to my father about my day, my fatigue, my fears. But every time, words got stuck in my throat. He was my father. Yet sometimes, I felt he was very far away from me. One day, when I achieved something great, I came to him with my heart full of joy. He listened, nodded, and said, "Now the real test begins." I smiled, because I had learned that some joys must be celebrated alone. I didn't hate my father. I was just tired of constantly proving myself, and perhaps that fatigue was called anger. I didn't know if my father ever heard the voice of my heart. But I knew that this story did not end here. Because when words fail, life itself begins to speak. And ahead, there was so much more to speak. And indeed, life began to speak. It wasn't that a huge event suddenly came, but small things gradually began to weigh on my heart. I was growing up. My questions were changing. My dreams too. But in front of my father, I was still the same, who only listened, never answered. During college, I began to recognize my own voice for the first time. I laughed with friends, argued, spoke my mind. But when I returned home, I became silent again. In front of my father, my voice automatically softened, as if my words feared his silence. One day, he asked me, "What are you planning to do next?" I mustered courage and said, "I want to continue my studies." He looked at me, that same serious gaze, and said, "Those are good dreams. But reality is different." That sentence put a slight crack in my dreams. I didn't argue. I just remained silent. In that silence, my anger grew a little deeper. I began to feel that my father didn't listen to me. He only made decisions, and I felt like a guest. In my own life, Mother often tried to explain, "Your father has carried many responsibilities. He is only afraid." I knew that, but knowing it did not lessen the pain. Sometimes, I would stand outside my father's room, thinking of going in and saying everything, telling him that I was strong, that I needed confidence, that I needed his support. But the door remained closed, and I would walk away. One evening, when we were all sitting together, my father suddenly said, "You have changed a lot." I was startled. I wanted to say, yes, because you never taught me to speak, only to endure. But I said nothing. I just smiled. And in that smile, many of my complaints were buried. I began to feel lonely from the inside. It wasn't that I lacked people, but the one person whose presence meant the most was the furthest away. I was angry at my father, but this anger was not loud. It was the kind of anger that hides within respect. And that is why it hurts the most. I did not know if my father ever noticed the change in my tone, but I knew that in my heart, a silent question grew stronger each day. Would I ever be allowed to live my life on my own? And perhaps the answer to this question was waiting for me with a great test in the coming days. And indeed, that test finally arrived. It wasn't that the day came loudly. It was just an ordinary day, where an extraordinary decision quietly awaited me. I got an opportunity I had been thinking about for years. A place where I could continue my studies, according to my own wishes. I wanted to tell my father first. I repeated the sentence in my mind many times. Father, I got an opportunity. But every time, his usual demeanor appeared in front of me, and my words stopped there. Finally, I sent the application alone. It wasn't rebellion. It was just the first step of a tired daughter listening to herself. When the results came, and I was selected, my hands were trembling. I was happy, but fear was included in that happiness. I knew my father wouldn't be pleased. I still remember that day. When I told him, he listened carefully, stayed silent for a few moments, and then said, "Why did you make this decision alone?" I had no answer that he could understand. I only managed to say, "Because I was afraid." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw anger in his eyes. He wasn't angry that I was leaving. He was angry that I hadn't included him in my decision. And I was angry because I felt I was never included. After that day, the silence in the house became heavier. We spoke, but only when necessary. I packed my things in my room, and with each item, I kept a memory. Sometimes, Mother would come and sit beside me, saying, "Time will heal everything." I nodded, but inside I knew that some distances cannot be reduced by time, only by conversation. The night before leaving, I stayed awake for a long time. I thought I would go to my father and say everything. I would tell him that I wasn't leaving him. I was leaving to find myself. I would tell him I didn't need permission. I needed his trust. But I stopped at the door and then returned. The next morning, I left home silently. My father was awake, but said nothing. And I said nothing too. I didn't know which of us felt the silent goodbye heavier, him or me, but I knew that this story had reached its most delicate turn. And indeed, silence began to speak. At first, everything at home seemed normal, but everything changed. My father's gaze lingered on me longer. The words that were never spoken now reflected in his eyes. I realized that he was slowly opening the doors of his heart. He now tried to understand, just by looking, what his daughter's silence was saying. A few days later, my father called me into his room. I entered, my heartbeat racing. He was sitting, head bowed, and stayed silent for a few moments. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "My daughter, I never tried to truly understand you. And perhaps all this became a pain for you." A small flutter ran through my heart, mixed with fear and hope. I said. Father, I didn't say all this because I was afraid. I wanted you to understand me, but staying silent seemed easier. He stayed silent, then held my hand once and said, I was wrong. I never showed you my love. I only thought that strictness would make you stronger. But I didn't think about what it would do to your heart. Tears fell from my eyes. This was the moment when the wall of anger broke. The words that were never said were now right before my eyes. I laid my head on his shoulder and silently let all my pain flow inside me. He also tried to hold himself together, but he couldn't stop. That night was the longest and the lightest night. Pain and love flowed together. I realized that sometimes silence can also be the language of love. And that language spoke very late, but it finally spoke. Now I knew that our silence was not distance. It was the depth of our love that could be felt without words. And indeed, the moment finally came when everything felt right. I and my father were no longer just father and daughter. We became friends again, friends who could understand each other's silence and feel peace from each other's presence. I realized that he was the same strict father, but now his gaze held a soft light. The words that were never spoken now could be expressed with a look, a touch. One day, when I returned home, he hugged me and said, My daughter, you have taught me that love is not measured by words, but by understanding. I always wanted to see you strong, but now I understand that strength doesn't mean silently enduring. I had both joy and tears in my eyes. I said, Father, I also understand that sometimes staying silent is not wrong, but the heart must always be heard. We both laughed. The laughter that hadn't been heard in my heart for years echoed in the room. From that day on, the silence between my father and me was no longer a distance. It became understanding. We spoke our hearts even when words fell short. I knew life would never always be easy. But today, I also knew that the bond between a father and daughter can be strengthened through love, patience, and understanding. And at that moment, I said from my heart, Father, I will always be your daughter. But now we are close to each other, even in silence. That was the moment when I first felt complete freedom in my heart. The moment when love finally won over pain and anger.